All right, guys. In the previous section of lectures, we had talked about some of the things that can influence the allele frequencies of populations, including natural selection, genetic drift, and gene flow. And we're going to expand on this idea of natural selection, especially as it pertains to the variation that it produces in a population. We had talked a little bit about the variation that is brought about by mutation and sexual recombination, and I'd like to spend a little bit more time on that. So of all the factors that change a gene pool, it's only natural selection that can cause a population to adapt to the environment. So previously, in the last section, we talked about genetic drift and gene flow, and those things do change the gene pool and the allele frequencies, but they don't necessarily cause adaptation to the environment. So as natural selection exists because of genetic variation, it's pertinent to discuss these different types of variation that we see in a population. So this is actually kind of an interesting set of topics as we work our way through this. But genetic variation occurs in individuals and populations of all species. I think that's been well established in the stuff that we've discussed. Though some phenotypic variation is not always inheritable, or is not always heritable. The butterflies that you see in front of you are actually examples of the same species, but they don't actually have, they have variation within the species, but that species that you see there is not necessarily heritable. That pattern that you see on the left, the orange and black pattern, is due to butterflies that emerge from their cocoon in the spring. And the white and black one on the right is a result of butterflies that emerge in the late summer. So even though there tends to be variation in populations, some of it's not even really heritable. But ones we're going to talk about here today are heritable, and some of this stuff is going to be just basic review. It might even be stuff that you've known but just hasn't been pointed out to you or given a definition to. So that's what we're going to get into, at least a little bit in this section here. So the first slide you see here discusses discrete or quantitative characteristics. And these are two classes of characteristics or traits that are seen in populations where when you talk about discrete characters or characteristics, they can be classified as either this or that. Okay, for instance, the colors of flowers that you see oftentimes, it can be either red or white or pink. So there's discrete characteristics, but there are other characteristics that are much more complicated in how they're inherited, and sometimes they're due to the expression of more than one gene at the same time. Sometimes they're due to expressions of multiple gene sets that have, some kind of bearing on a single trait. For instance, some people think that's kind of what intelligence is. They think it's a multitude of different types of genes and interactions that have some kind of phenotype, which manifests as your IQ or how smart you are. And these are called quantitative characteristics, in which they vary along a continuum within a population. So if we look over on the picture on the right, let me get my pointer out here. Wrong one. Golly, done with that. Third time's a charm. There we go. So if we look at this picture on the right, this shows the characteristic of intelligence, which varies over a continuum, oftentimes known as the bell curve. And contrary to what some educators will tell you, there is a bell curve. There are quite a few people that find themselves in this middle area where they're pretty bright. They're not dumb. And then you got these geniuses over here, the Einsteins at the very far end of the bell scale, and then you've got the folks who maybe aren't so bright on the other end. I myself probably land right in here. Most of you guys are at least in this orange and probably all the way down to this gray. With a little bit of hard work, I kind of bump myself over to this one sometimes, not always, but you get the idea. There's various things in your genetics and in your life experience that kind of add to this continuum. But it does manifest itself as a variation in our population and thus needs to be discussed. And we can compare that to the discrete characteristics where I mentioned, white or red coloration or something like that. It's not just bright and smart or dumb and smart people. It's dumb people. It's pretty bright people. And then you got some that have some characteristics of really smart, and then they're really dumb at other things. I don't mean to be politically incorrect on all this stuff, but it's just that's the way the world is sometimes. But you've got this continuation, this continuum of traits across a bell curve in this case. Polymorphisms. Polymorphisms are describing a population in which two or more distinct morphs or forms for a character are represented. So in this case, phenotypic polymorphisms describe what the thing looks like. So I've included a phenotypic polymorphism here with the the combs and the crests and the beards of chickens. So we've got these different forms that are represented in what the chicken actually looks like, okay? And that's what they're talking about here in terms of looking at a population and seeing these different phenotypes manifested for different types of traits. A phenotypic polymorphism for humans you could consider would be like hair color, right? We've got blonde and brown and red and all these kind of different colors in between, these distinct colors in between. Genetic polymorphisms are heritable components of characters that occur along a continuum or a population, very similar to what we talked about with the bell curve. The genetics that find themselves making up your intelligence land along this polymorphism, this multiple form genetic look into the intelligence of a human being. We see variation between populations, and we can start that discussion by looking at geographic variation. The example that's given on the right-hand side here is two different mouse populations, and these gene pools of these two different mice populations happen to be different. They look like very similar mice, like this mouse right here looks almost identical to this mouse. But they do share distinct variations, and those variations are due to where they find themselves geographically on this island. You notice the ones at the top are located on the left side of the mountain, or I'll say it's the west side of the mountain along the coastline, and the red population is located kind of more centrally in the mountain, some along the coast, some on top of a mountaintop. But one thing you'll notice here is that what makes them different gene pools is the fact that their genes are quite literally different in some case. This looks like a really weird karyotype that you probably have never seen before, and what it's describing here is through the divergence of these two animals. So you've got both of these two different mice populations going in different directions in terms of their genetics. And they're coming very close to speciation, new speciation happening. But one of the reasons that you see this divergence is because their chromosomes have actually fused. Okay, so like in this one, for instance, it's telling us that chromosome 2 and 4 have actually fused together. And in this one, it's telling us that chromosome 2 and 19 fused together. So we see these weird fusions of chromosomes. We know that these two populations are related, but they are distinctly different. They have this variation based on where they're located in their geographic regions. It's kind of an interesting take on variation in terms of looking at their chromosomes and their karyotypes, because you don't see a whole lot of variation within these two populations phenotypically, but you do see it genetically. Okay, you see it with the fused chromosomes and how they are different. The second example of variation between populations can be exhibited on something called a cline. So if we look at this population of green plants with white flowers, they happen to find themselves along the Sierra Nevada mountain range. And these would be all, basically the same species, right? But you have different populations based on where you see them on the mountain range. Okay, so we see these tall plants here at lower altitudes than these small ones. These small ones are found at higher altitudes. And so it is this environmental impact on what these things look like, their phenotypes, based on where you find them. So there is variation even within these populations. So this population here of large plants is going to be distinctly different from this population here of small plants. They're still the same plant, they're still part of the same species, but you see variation within the populations, much the same way that you see this variation of the two mice, the same species, but there is variation within the two populations of them. And so this Klein depicts the altitude's effect on what these plants look like, even within the same species, but in different populations. We see body mass can be planted or plotted on a Klein as well. I think this is moose, yes, the moose body mass. It's one of the Nordic countries. I couldn't tell you by the look of it. But the body mass of moose, if you look at it, actually goes up with the latitude. Okay, and so you might ask yourself why that would be. If you want to pause the video and kind of think on it a little bit, why would the average body mass of the moose go up, okay, as we see it going up here, with an increase in latitude as it goes more this way in the country? Okay, so pause it, think about it. Okay, the reason probably is because the further you go north, the more cold it gets. The more cold it gets, the more body mass you need, right? And the more body mass you need, or the more body mass you get, the more you weigh. So you're probably, at some point, you are putting on fat, okay, as a moose. And fat can help with insulation. But another thing, if you remember back to surface area to volume ratios, if you decrease your surface area to volume ratio, you will decrease the amount of material or energy that will flow out of you. Okay, so the bigger the moose, the less energy is going to flow out of the moose. And when you live at higher latitudes, more north, you want less energy to flow out of you because you want to conserve it, to keep that energy inside of you to warm you up. Okay, so it's a multitude of things here when you see an increase of body mass on a Klein as well. So kind of an interesting take into it. So we see variation at latitude, we see variation at altitude, and even within geographic regions. Kind of an interesting thing. We also see this happen with human beings, where even within our own species, again, human beings, there are different populations that have different variation within them. And again, just like the moose and just like the plant on the Sierra Nevadas, ours does the trait that I'm thinking of, skin color, does vary or change with latitude and also altitude. So if you look at where we see the equator is where the Earth gets the most sunlight, and the color grades on the continents here illustrates how dark the skin color is of the people who live there. Okay, so the areas that we see near the equator tend to have the people with the darkest skin, and the reason for that is because it protects them. That dark skin protects them from the extra UV light. And as you work your way further north, where there's less sunlight, there are far less darker skinned people in those regions, especially you see up in here in Canada and Russia and places like Greenland, places like that. But even really far south in South America, where you're getting far away from the sunlight as well. Now, one thing you'll notice is that places like Tibet, the Himalayas, or places like Chile, okay, the Andes Mountains, you'll notice that there is really dark-skinned people here and relatively dark-skinned people here. Now, at this point in the in the Himalayas and also in the Andes, you're pretty far away from the equator, especially when you get down here. That's pretty far away from the equator, and when you get up here, that's really far away from the equator. But you notice these dark patches, so indicating that people who live here have very dark skin. Now, the reason for that is because they live at higher altitudes. Okay, higher up away from the surface of the Earth, and when you're higher up away from the surface of the Earth, you are closer to the sun. That's right. And so when you're closer to the sun, you still need protection from that UV light. So it's kind of an interesting look into how a latitude, distance from the equator, and also altitude, distance away from the surface of the Earth, affects skin color in human beings. Okay. So as we work our way through this stuff, we're going to take a little bit closer look at natural selection and some of the things that go into it. Natural selection increases certain genotypes by fitting organisms to their environment over generations. We know that. That's part of what goes into the definition of natural selection. It hasn't necessarily been stated like that, but we're going to talk about some of the mechanisms by which this happens. Okay. Evolutionary fitness, also known as survival of the fittest, is another way of kind of saying natural selection. Okay, fitness is the contribution an individual makes to the gene pool of the next generation relative to the contribution of others. Okay, now when we talk about evolution by way of natural selection, as Darwin pointed it out, he said that individuals who have a higher reproductive success rate will survive, means they will have survived long enough to reproduce, and then they get to send their genes on to the next generation. This is just a more contrite way of saying those exact things, a different angle into looking at the explanations of natural selection. Okay, so relative fitness is the contribution of a certain genotype to the next generation compared to contributions of alternative genotypes. And this is something that can be quantified. You can look into this. You can look at reproductive rates of different individuals. So when we talk about survival of the fittest, it doesn't mean like, this is from the movie Predator from when I was young, so I don't know how many of you guys have even seen this. It's not like that. It's not like you're in a fight to the death between some alien or something like that, and you're fighting for your life. It's more this relative reproductive success that Darwin had talked about. In some rare instances, you may find that two populations, two different species of animals might have some kind of, warring conflict that goes on, and one might win out. But it's not like survival of the fittest, like as in a battle or a fight. It means relative reproductive success, effectively. Okay. Now we can see this happen in selection happen in a couple of different ways. Okay, there's 3 modes of selection that you see listed up on the screen. And selection favors certain genotypes by acting on phenotypes of certain organisms. Now, this is something I stated to you, I think, at the beginning of this lecture, and here it is finally pointed out. I think I told you in your notes to put basically just that natural selection works on our phenotypes, and in these different modes of selection, we can kind of see that. Now they've named them and they've given them the definition, but it is something that you're going to have to be able to identify because these are very high probability of being represented on the AP test. So directional selection favors individuals at one end of a phenotypic range. Disruptive selection favors individuals at 2 extremes of a phenotypic range. And stabilizing selection favors intermediate variance and acts against extrees. And so this kind of goes back even to when I discussed the different types of variation, just previously in this lecture, where we looked at genetic polymorphisms and we looked at quantitative characteristics, where you see kind of a bell curve, and is indicated here with the color of these mice. You have mice that are on the extreme end on this side white, and on this other extreme end, you see them as kind of dark brown or black. Okay. So we could we could have any coloration in between. We could have light brown, we could have a little bit darker brown, like a medium, and then kind of a medium dark brown. Anywhere along this continuation that we see right here, anywhere along this bell curve. And so this tells us that there are quite a few of these medium ones and less of the dark ones and less of the light ones. You get the idea of how that works. Now, these different types of selections compare to what was seen in the original population. So if we look at directional selection, what has happened with directional selection is that there is some kind of selective pressure. Okay, selective pressure is something that might be eating these mice. So maybe an owl or a hawk or something like that. There's some kind of selective pressure for directional selection that has chosen to pick off and eat the lighter colored ones. Maybe it's the fact that they stand out more against their background, and so they're seen more often. So what directional selection describes is that since these ones are eaten more often, they reproduce less, and these darker ones, which kind of blend in a little bit better, are seen less and get to reproduce more. So the entire curve is going to shift over to the right in this case, kind of changing the continuum so that we have more of the darker ones and almost none of the middle ones. Okay. Now in the second scenario, the disruptive selection, some kind of selective pressure has selected against the middle grade ones, the ones that are kind of medium brown. And as a result, we see this peak of the original population looks as if it's been depressed. And the reason for that is because a hawk or whatever, owl or something, is eating the ones in the middle, which means there's less of them there. And what's left over are the ones in the extremes. Okay, so we've got a lot of the white ones and a lot of the black ones, and they get to reproduce at a much higher rate. So their populations, their frequency of those individuals in the population are going to go up while the middle ones go down. Whereas stabilizing selection is just the complete opposite, where some kind of selective pressure eats the ones at the extreme, and it leaves only the ones alive that are in the middle. And as a result, they get to reproduce more often. So there are different modes of natural selection in a population, and these modes of selection work on the different variations that you see within a population. So that's one of the reasons why it's good to have population variation, and why I spend a little bit of time talking about it, and the creation of it through mutation and the spreading of it through sexual recombination, because natural selection works on these different traits within the population. So how do we preserve genetic variation if it is so important? I just got done literally 10 seconds ago telling you how important variation is in a population. How do we maintain it? Well, there's a couple of ways that that we pass on our genetics just kind of inherently keeps that variation alive and well within us. Okay, number one, diploidy maintains genetic variation in the form of hidden recessive alleles. Okay, so being diploid, meaning that we have two copies of a trait, or a trait. We got one from mom and we got one from dad, if you recall that. So maybe the one from mom was the dominant one and the one from dad was the recessive one. This one happens to be the most appropriate one in our current climate, maybe environment. This particular trait helps us survive better. So it's going to be dominant and win out over this one and be manifest in the population as a dominant phenotype. Okay, and that might be a good thing, but guess what happens? Over the course of time, environments change, and maybe they change so drastically that this is not a good thing. This one here, this dominant phenotype happens to be detrimental to survival of the organism, but maybe the recessive one is beneficial, but it's hidden. Okay? And just because it's hidden doesn't mean it can't come back out. And we know that for a fact that it comes back out when you get two copies of it. So if we have a decline in this one, this dominant one, it allows the recessive one to pop its head out again and say, look, I've been a trait that's been here all along. Not many people had me, but I'm here to save the day. in these ever-changing environments. And so diploidy can help us to maintain this genetic variation without having a detrimental, like a currently detrimental recessive one in our population until maybe it's needed, okay? Meaning it gets overridden by the dominant one that is better for the current situation, okay? Balancing selection provides a situation when natural selection maintains stable frequencies of two or more phenotypic forms in a population, like balanced polymorphisms. The one that I think is really, really interesting is heterozygous advantage, in which some individuals who are heterozygous at particular loci have greater fitness than homozygotes. Okay, now under a lot of conditions, right, it's probably better to be homozygous dominant for a condition that produces a phenotype that helps you live, because that means you and your offspring are going to have a higher chance of getting more copies of that dominant phenotype, right, or that dominant allele to make the phenotype. At the other end of that spectrum, maybe there is some benefit to being homozygous recessive. As I mentioned before, maybe homozygous recessive traits at some point can become good in the environment, and it would be beneficial for you and your offspring to have as many of those alleles in the population as they can. But in some situations, it's good to be just right in the middle, kind of hedge your bets, be heterozygous, okay? And one of the things that I find very fascinating is how much you can learn from sickle cell anemia, because it describes exactly what happens in heterozygous advantage. So if we look at sickle cell anemia is a type of anemia which we've talked about due to a mutation. Those people who are homozygous dominant for blood cells construction get normal blood cells, and they do not get sickle cell anemia. People who are homozygous recessive for sickle cell anemia means they have two copies of the mutated gene, and they get sickle cell shaped blood cells. Their blood cells are not constructed properly, and they turn into these kind of half moon shaped things, kind of look like that, and they get stuck in your blood vessels. It can be painful and sometimes even deadly, right? Now, people in the middle, people who are heterozygous for sickle cell and normal, okay, have a copy of each, phenotypically have normal blood cells, okay? But something in that heterozygous, the fact that they get that single copy of the recessive allele, something about that causes the blood cells to be changed ever so slightly to the point where malaria does not like to infect the bloodstream of that particular type, okay? So you can get malaria as somebody who's heterozygous, but it wouldn't be really, really bad. Okay, let's talk about the extremes as they pertain to malaria. People who have homozygous dominant for regular blood type will get malaria, and it gets really, really bad. Okay, malaria is a parasite that feeds it off the blood in the bloodstream. They can get it, and they'll get really, really bad cases of it. Okay, people who have sickle cell anemia, because their blood cells are oddly shaped, don't really get malaria. So they're kind of in this situation like, cool, I have sickle cell anemia, so I might die of that, but at least I don't get malaria and die. These people over here are like, oh, great, I've got no sickle cell anemia, so I'm not going to die of that, but malaria might get me. But the people in the middle are the place to be. The heterozygotes, they don't have malaria, or they don't get malaria really bad, I should say, and they don't have sickle cell anemia. So they kind of have the best of both worlds, if you could say, if you can call it that. And as a result, you have a higher frequency of sickle cell alleles in certain populations where malaria is really prevalent, as you can see in Africa. This is also one of the reasons why people who are African American have a higher incidence of sickle cell anemia. Okay? It's because of their ancestry. Their ancestry has a deep history of sickle cell anemia, or sickle cell alleles because it helps them combat malaria. I think it's just fascinating how linked all of that is, and how we can see that passed on through multiple generations, and we can even see it manifest here in America with people who have African ancestry. Kind of neat. I think what we're going to do now, I'm going to not necessarily speed through this, but we're going to take a time out after I get done with this, and I'm going to show you some really fun videos. I think we'll do this during the next in-person class that I see you. Really fun videos that go along with the information that you see right here. Sexual selection also is pertinent to talk about when we discuss natural selection, because it helps organisms do this thing which Darwin mentioned, have differential reproductive success, but they do it in a way that's different. They do it in a way that is more competitive than it is survival. Like Darwin says, okay, natural selection tells us that if the individual survives, that means they're going to have a higher chance of reproducing. That means they can pass their genes on to the next generation. When we talk about sexual selection, you still have this differential reproductive success, but it's less about surviving and more about the show. Okay, and that's what's really fun to get into. This is what you see on nature documentaries. And so we finally come to it after, 7 months of pandemic learning, where you get to learn stuff that's actually kind of fun from nature documentaries. Okay, but sexual selection is natural selection for the success of mating. So not only do you have to survive, right, but you've also got to be able to figure out a way to mate successfully. So this can result in what's known as sexual dimorphism, which is a marked difference between the sexes in their secondary sexual characteristics. And we see this at least a little bit in human beings. I mean, there are definitely differences between males and females in human beings. Males generally are bigger. They have facial hair, wider shoulders. Obviously the sex organs are obviously different, but that's beside the point. Deeper voices, things of that nature, compared to the female of the species. And we see this oftentimes in many species in nature as well. So let's talk about different types of sexual selection. Intrasexual selection describes direct competition among individuals of one sex for the mating rights of the other. I put rights in quotation because that's kind of what happens. If you directly compete good enough against either males of the same sex, you get the right to mate with the females of the other, of the same species, right? Now, oftentimes this can be seen as combat for sex, okay? And we see this combat happen in elephant seals. We see it happen in many, many different types of animals. The one that always pops into my mind is the one with elephant seals. And so one of the videos I want to show you is elephant seals fighting for the rights to mate with the females of the species. But you also do see females combating for rights to mate with the males of the sex. I wanted to find one of each because I know that most of the examples of intrasexual selection involve fighting of males to mate with the females of the species, but I was almost certain I'd be able to find one where it's females that fight, and they do. It's just not nearly as prevalent. Ring-tailed lemurs are an instance where they will sometimes fight other females, but they will also dominate the males. They will physically dominate the males to try and make them mate with them. So it's kind of an interesting dichotomy. But we'll watch some pictures of, or some movies of intrasexual selection so you can get the idea. And it's always fun to throw that stuff in there. Okay. Birds of paradise are really, Birds of paradise are really good examples of the next type of sexual selection called intersexual selection. Oh, bugger. I think I've messed these up. Let me see if I can do something here. I'm going to pause this and figure this out. All right, I figured it out. So this is a typo right here. I'm not going to change it, but I'd like you to change it. This should say intersexual selection. Okay, birds of paradise are great examples of intersexual selection, which is competition among individuals of one sex for mates of the opposite sex. So in this case, this is described as mate choice. Females are usually really choosy, and in this case, many of the examples are of the females being choosy and the males trying to wow the female into having sex with them to make babies. So the selection may depend on the showiness of the male's appearance. It might depend on how well they dance. It might depend on how well they sing a certain song. It might depend on how well those individuals provide gifts for the female. It's many different things. And so what we're going to do, again, the same way that I wanted to show you videos of intrasexual selection with the combat between the males for the mating rights of the female. I'd like to show you, when we come back to class, some videos of different types of sexual selection, intersexual selection, where the female is really choosy about which male she actually mates with. And so one of the reasons that you see these drastic looks to these birds right here, the drastic physical appearance to these animals, is because of extreme intersexual selection driving extreme sexual dimorphism, okay? Because with these animals, the more extreme their feathers are, the more elaborate their dances are, and the better that they are at both of them, at being beautiful and showy and dancing, is an indicator to the female how good of a baby that they would be able to make. Okay, so we'll elaborate a little bit on this, and I'll ask you some thought questions, some thought experiment questions on why these animals look the way they do, and what information that can convey to the female of the same species. Okay, so it might have popped into your head a question as to, well, can natural selection fashion perfect organisms? And the answer is no. Natural selection cannot fashion perfect organisms. We think that we think being humans that we are perfect organisms, but I can tell you right off the bat that one swift change in something extremely important in our environment could be our downfall. Okay, we are a little bit too intelligent to for our own good sometimes, and we think that we are the most perfect things that have ever evolved, right, or been around because of natural selection. But we don't adapt to things as well as some other species. We don't adapt to some things as well as others do. And evolution is limited by historical constraints. Okay, we are the way we are because of our ancestors. Okay, if there's a 50% chance that if the dinosaurs were around at the time we were, they would be the dominant species. We'd be walking, talking dinosaurs. Okay, and the way current organisms are is based on what there was to work with when those things started to evolve. So evolution and natural selection are limited by what was there to begin with. Okay, as a result, those organisms weren't perfect back then, and we aren't now. Okay, adaptations are often compromises. Natural selection picked an adaptation that worked in the current environment, but maybe some other one had to suffer. Some other adaptation wasn't allowed to be there because it didn't provide the right combination. Okay, so if organisms could be made perfect, we'd get all the cool adaptations. We'd get them all. We'd be able to change our skin color, right? Like the chameleon. But that's just not how it works. But we got big brains, so that works, right? So you have to compromise. We had one going. We just didn't have the historical context to do the changing skin color. Okay, chance and natural selection interact. Chance is a huge part of it. The fact that we were around at a very pertinent time in evolutionary history is big. We had just come off a fresh, clean meteor strike, and mammals were starting to become a kind of prominent, and just got lucky. That's sometimes all it is. Selection can only edit existing variations. Kind of goes along with this historical constraints idea that you see up here. So if we didn't have certain structures in our body to begin with, for instance, walking upright, we're one of the few organisms that walk upright. It's actually quite bad on your hips and stuff like that if they're not shaped properly. But at some point in evolutionary history, there was ancestors that had hips that were shaped just the right way, okay, probably because of some mutation or mutations. And natural selection worked off of that newly formed or newly mutated hip structure. And as a result, we walk upright. The opposable thumb. At some point in our evolutionary history, there was some creature that had an opposable thumb that was maybe not as opposable as ours, but it still had one. But the fact of the matter is that it was there and it's been made better, but we can't always do it perfectly. I've spent far too much time on this slide. It's probably not even going to be on the test. I just find it fascinating to kind of speculate as to why we could never fashion perfect organisms by natural selection. But perfect in the context of like the way we think, right? Where you can do everything and be prepared for everything. But I hope this stuff was fascinating for you. Like I said, I'm going to come back. This medium is not good for showing videos, so we'll watch some of those videos and discuss some of those different sexual selection things in class. So I'll see you then. Have a good one.